Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Martin. So I am the Mustelid Conservation Officer with the Vincent Wildlife Trust, and today I'm just going to give a whistle-stop tour of pine martens and polecats, specifically the changing fortunes of both species in Britain, their current conservation status, and a bit about some of the monitoring and conservation programs we've been doing for them with the VWT. So to provide a bit of context, pine martens and polecats are both in the mustelid, or the weasel family. This is the British mustelid family, missing the badger, unfortunately. But in terms of what the family is made up of, we have badgers, otters, pine martens, the non-native invasive American mink, polecat, stoat, and weasel. So you can see from this lineup that pine martens and polecats are both kind of medium-sized mustelids, so they're much bigger than stoats and weasels, but significantly smaller than otters and badgers. So, as Martin has just alluded to, polecats are probably most well known to a lot of people because they are the ancestor of the domestic ferret. So ferrets were domesticated from polecats about 2,000 years ago in southern Europe. So they're about the size of a ferret. They have this really characteristic kind of bandit facial mask. The males are quite a bit larger than females, and there's a really nice specimen in the corner over there, if anyone hasn't seen one and wants to have a look later. They're mostly nocturnal, but they can be quite diurnal during the summer. They are solitary throughout the year, apart from when they are mating or breeding. So they mate, so we're coming up to the mating season now. They mate between March and May. One of the ways we often know it's the mating season is because we receive a huge increase in reports of road casualty polecats, which are normally males, because the males are roaming around more looking for females, obviously aren't too bright and end up getting run over on the road, unfortunately. So they have a short gestation period of about 40 days, and then they have their kits that are born, normally May through June. They can have up to 10 kits, but between 4 and 6 is more normal. And the kits stay with the mother throughout the summer and then disperse in the autumn. And then in the autumn, we see another increase in polecat road casualties as a lot of the juveniles don't make their first winter and they get run over while they're dispersing in the autumn. Polecats are hugely reliant on rabbits, so about 80% of polecat diet is rabbit. They can also eat quite a lot of rats and other small mammals and amphibians. The name is thought to come from Polechat, which is French for chicken cat. This is referring to the fact that polecats like chickens and will take chickens if they can get a free, easy meal. So the full name for the polecat is the European or Western polecats. They're not just found in Britain, they're found through Europe, so right the way from Britain and Portugal in the west over to parts of Russia in the east. They're absent from Ireland and northern Scandinavia. They are currently categorized as least concern by the IUCN, but actually we've just published a review we completed reviewing the status of polecats in all European countries, and we found that 20 countries across Europe were reporting polecat population declines, and Britain is only one of 2 countries, the other being Switzerland, where the polecat population is actually increasing. So we now think that polecats are in trouble across Europe, and that's potentially quite worrying. Okay, so polecats aren't particularly fussy in their habitat and resource choice, so they can live in a wide range of habitats with no strong dependence on any particular one habitat type. Having said that, they are more numerous in lowland landscapes. The home range is bigger for males than females, as you would expect. So male home range can range from less than 1 to 4 kilometers squared. For females, it can be as small as 0.2 up to just over 1 kilometer squared. So they don't have massive home ranges. From radio tracking studies, we know that they use sort of linear features in the landscape when they're moving around, so things like woodland edges and hedgerows and field boundaries, and also farm buildings. They use existing structures for den sites. So a favorite den site is a rabbit burrow, and they'll also use things like haystacks and log piles. Increasingly, we're getting reports of kind of suburban polecats, so polecats that come into people's gardens. We've had reports of them living in or under people's sheds, underneath garden decking, and even getting into people's garages as well. In the winter, they have reduced activity, they don't hibernate, but they tend to have an increased use of farm buildings where they'll go in, eat rats, and lay up in the kind of haystacks or other structures. Interestingly, elsewhere in Europe, polecats are really highly associated with wetland habitats, but we don't tend to see that so much here in Britain. So polecats have a bit of a sad history in Britain, as a lot of our mustelids do. They were once widespread. So this is a map from 1800 showing that polecats were everywhere. They arrived here after the last ice age from southern Europe, so they would have crossed over the land bridge we would have had with the continent. And they were really common and widespread during the Mesolithic period. So the estimate is that we had around 110,000 polecats, which would have made them our third commonest carnivore after the weasel and the pine marten. But polecats suffered really badly due to human actions. So the term polecat was used a lot as an insult, and they were killed in highest numbers than any other animal apart from the mole. And this really took its toll on the polecat population. So this map is from 1880, so you can see the dark green areas are the only areas where polecats were considered common. Elsewhere in the pale areas is where they were becoming rare. And you can see they'd already become extinct in central and southern Scotland and parts of East Anglia and southeast England. And then the lowest point of the polecat was around 1915, much like pine marten and wildcat. So by this time, they were restricted to a small area of mid Wales and the border counties of Herefordshire and Shropshire. Thankfully, the population managed to recover and started recovering around the 1940s, 1950s. This was almost entirely down to a reduction in persecution pressure from the world wars. So a lot of gamekeepers went off to fight in the world wars and didn't come back. So there was a real reduction in gamekeeping activity, which probably saved the polecat, but also pine marten and wildcat and some of our birds of prey from becoming extinct almost entirely. Also, the gin trap was banned in the 1950s, which would have reduced fatalities from that, and an increase in the rabbit population would have also helped the polecat. So polecats have some very weak legal protection on Schedule 6 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which prohibits certain methods of taking or killing them, but many polecats are still killed now through non-targeted trapping approaches. So in order to track the recovery of the polecat, the Vincent Wildlife Trust has carried out 3 distribution surveys in the 1990s, then again in 2004 to 2006, and most recently in 2014-2015. This is based on the collection of road casualties, because polecats are very elusive and we don't have decent survey methods for surveying populations. Collecting road casualties is the best basis on which to base a survey like this. So what we found from our last distribution survey that finished in 2015 is that polecats are continuing to recover and spread back into parts of their former range in England and Scotland. So they're now pretty widespread in parts of central, southern and eastern England, including parts of Suffolk, and are still widespread in Wales as well. So to dive into that in a bit more detail, we also have populations that have been reintroduced in northwest England. So there was a reintroduction in Cumbria in the 1970s and 80s, and also into Argyll and Perthshire in Scotland. So this map shows how the population has changed in just under 10 years. So the map on the left is what the population looked like in 2006. Then 9 years on in 2015, you can see that it's continuing its march eastwards and southwards. So specifically, the most kind of extensive recolonization was actually in East Anglia, but also down into Kent, Devon and Cornwall, and into Lincolnshire, Rutland, and we had the first records in Dumfriesshire in Scotland as well. And importantly, the population is maintaining its range in its historical stronghold in Wales and the West Midlands. The one place where polecats do seem to be struggling is parts of northern England around Yorkshire and Durham. So the core population seems to be struggling to get into southern Yorkshire, and I suspect this is because of the really dense road and rail network in that part of the country. Martin mentioned polecat ferrets, so we were also recording polecat ferrets in our survey. What we found, which was consistent with previous surveys, is that polecat ferrets, or animals we classify as polecat ferrets, tend to be more widespread in the outside of the core range, which would include places like East Anglia, and also in reintroduced populations. So, to hone it into a more local perspective, in Suffolk, polecats were reported to have gone extinct around 1900. They probably recolonized West Suffolk in the early 2000s, and there might be someone here who can tell me different. But these are the records we received in our most recent survey in 2014-2015. And notably, polecats seem to have expanded their range quite extensively into East Anglia since the previous survey we did. So from our survey, we had a concentration of records in southwest Suffolk on the Essex border, which makes sense because this is where polecats have probably recolonized from. But we had records from a pretty widely spaced apart area of Suffolk. And most of these records were true polecats, but we did have a mixture of true polecats and polecat ferrets. So polecats are doing really well in Britain, which is good news. However, there are several threats to the species, so we can't kind of completely take our eye off the ball, as it were. So one of the main threats to polecats is secondary rodenticide poisoning. This is when polecats and other predators consume prey that have ingested poison. So with polecats, it's almost entirely down to rats. So this also affects species like stoats and weasels and also a lot of our birds of prey. So we did a study in the 1990s that showed that around a third of polecats had been exposed to rodenticides. When we repeated this, and this is due for publication in the next few weeks, that exposure level has gone up to 79%. So 79% of polecats we analysed from our last national survey had been exposed to rodenticides, and we tested for 4 rodenticides, and some polecats have been exposed to as many as 4 different rodenticide components. So that's a pretty worrying trend. The other issue that affects polecats is accidental or deliberate trapping. So this polecat here is one that was caught in a fen trap set, or tunnel trap as they're often called. And these traps are meant to be set with excluders in areas where you know that you might have species like polecats or pine martens. And fen traps aren't designed to kill animals as big as polecats. So this animal wasn't actually killed, but it was obviously very injured. And this sort of thing probably goes on a lot. We probably only hear the kind of tip of the iceberg. But this is something that could possibly hamper the polecat's recovery, particularly in areas where there's a lot of high gamekeeping activity, like the Pennines. And the final potential threat to polecats is hybridization with domestic or feral ferrets. So polecats and ferrets can and do breed and produce fertile offspring, which are called hybrids. This is, as I mentioned before, most frequently an issue outside of the core polecat population and in reintroduced populations, but it could potentially have issues for the genetic integrity of the polecat population. The second issue arising from hybridization is that it makes it difficult to distinguish between polecats and polecat ferrets. So it makes biological recorders' jobs difficult. But we have produced guidelines for how to identify polecats from polecat ferrets, which we would recommend using. So on to pine martens now. Pine martens are the only marten species we have that's native to Britain. They're bigger than polecats. They're about the size of a small domestic cat, and the males are bigger than females. Like polecats, they are solitary for most of the year. They mate in July and August, and they're a bit different to polecats in that they have delayed implantation. So the females don't become pregnant straight after mating. They get pregnant in the following February, and then they give birth between March and May. And they can have between 1 and 5 young, but it's typically 2 or 3 in Britain. And the kits stay with the mother throughout the summer and then disperse to find their own territories in autumn, winter. They are largely nocturnal or crepuscular, so active at dawn and dusk, but they are quite diurnal during the summer months, so sort of similar to polecats. Even though they're technically carnivores, they have a really omnivorous diet, and they're very opportunistic. So the majority of their diet comprises small mammals, and in Britain, field vole is a key prey item. They also take a lot of fruit in the autumn, and small birds and eggs, invertebrates and carrion, and their diet varies kind of seasonally and geographically as well. So similar to polecats, pine martens are a European species, so they are found elsewhere in Europe. They have a very widespread distribution. They are also categorized as least concern by the IUCN, and they're actually still harvested for their fur in many countries in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. They have two close relatives. One is the stone marten, sometimes called the beech marten, which is found on the continent, and secondly, the American marten, which, as the name would suggest, is found in North America. So pine martens are a lot fussier than polecats in terms of their habitat selection. So they're what we often refer to as a 3D habitat specialist, and they are typically associated with extensive woodland. One of the reasons for this is their need to be above ground. So they prefer to den in above ground sites, and particularly tree cavities. So they have this affinity with old growth features in extensive woodland. One of the reasons for this is due to predation avoidance. So pine martens can be predated by foxes and golden eagles in Britain. Elsewhere in Europe, they would also be killed by things like lynx and wolves and some of the bigger birds of prey that they have on the continent. So by being above ground, that's a predation avoidance strategy. When they can't den above ground, because there's a lack of above ground den sites available, they will use ground-based sites such as root plates where you have trees that have come over, or rock crevices or burrows. Pine marten home range size varies hugely depending on the quality of habitat and prey availability. It's typically somewhere between 1 and 10 kilometres squared. The largest ever recorded in Britain was 56 kilometres squared, which was from a radio tracking study in Galloway Forest in southwest Scotland. Pine martens can actually occupy some non-woodland habitats, so there's more research coming out now that's showing that pine martens might not be as woodland dependent as we previously believed, and that it's probably actually more accurate to refer to them as tree dependent. So they can persist in some landscapes that are kind of agricultural matrices with like riparian corridors and hedgerows, and some level of woodland fragmentation is actually beneficial for martens because it leads to an increase in small mammal density, so provides extra foraging opportunities for them. So the history of the pine marten in Britain is much the same as the polecat in that they arrived here after the last ice age. During the Mesolithic era, there would have been almost continuous woodland cover across Britain, so perfect conditions for a woodland specialist like the pine marten. At this time, they would have been our second commonest carnivore after the weasel, and it's estimated there are around 147,500 pine martens during Britain during this time. So they were incredibly abundant. Then we started clearing our woodlands for agriculture, and woodland cover in Britain went down to a low of just over 5% at the end of the 19th century, and a lot of this woodland was highly fragmented, small and isolated, so not good conditions for a woodland specialist. And then the second factor that really caused decline for pine martens was persecution. So pine martens were trapped for their fur, for using in making clothing, also for game preservation. So as a predator, pine martens will take game like pheasants and partridges, also chickens and ducks if they can. So they've traditionally been quite unliked by the gamekeeping fraternity. So that really hammered the nail in the coffin of the pine marten. So this map is from 1850, so even as early as then, pine martens have become extinct through pretty much a lot of central and southern England. So the yellow areas on the map are where they were becoming scarce, and the green areas are where they were only still considered common. So that's the Northwest Highlands of Scotland and parts of northern England. It's thought they became extinct in Suffolk between 1860 and 1880, so quite early on. And then, same as the polecat, around 1915 was the lowest point for the pine marten. So they had become pushed out of most of England and Wales and just clung on in places like the Lake District, parts of Snowdonia and other parts of Wales. And their only real stronghold was in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland. Then, similar to the polecat, their numbers started to recover when there was a reduction in persecution pressure. So recovery was first noted in Scotland from the 1930s onwards, and the population started to move out of its Highland stronghold. However, in England and Wales, there's been no such recovery, and pine martens are still very rare here. So they are listed on Schedule 5 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which prohibits all taking or killing of pine martens. Sorry, I'm having issues with the clicker. So yeah, this is the distribution of pine martens today. So they are still extinct in most of England and Wales. There have been populations, or at least animals, confirmed in Shropshire, Hampshire, and also parts of Northumberland and Cumbria up in the north. They've been recovering in Scotland since around the mid-20th century. We have been carrying out a population reinforcement in Wales, which I'm going to come on to talk about, but they still remain our second rarest carnivore after the Scottish wildcat. So in Scotland, the recovery has been pretty phenomenal. So this was the first survey that the Vincent Wildlife Trust carried out in the early 1980s. So you can see they were still mostly restricted to the northwest. There had been a reintroduction in the southwest in Galloway Forest. And then we did some work a couple of years ago with Scottish Natural Heritage, and this is the distribution roughly of pine martens in Scotland today. So they've recolonised most of north of the Central Belt, so north of Glasgow and Edinburgh, and then there's 2 populations in the south of Scotland that have arisen from reintroductions or releases. But as I said, this hasn't been the case in England and Wales. Pine martens have shown no signs of recovering here. So as a result of this, the Vincent Wildlife Trust initiated its Pine Marten Recovery Project. This was due to the fact that we felt the remnant populations in England and Wales were vulnerable to extinction, and clearly natural recolonisation to Wales or central southern England from Scotland is really unlikely, because that's a really long way for a pine marten to walk, and also there's a lot of barriers in the way. So we decided that reinforcements or translocations were required to kind of secure the future of pine martens in southern Britain. So we started out by carrying out a 2-year feasibility study. A lot of this was based around doing a habitat suitability model to identify areas of suitable habitat for pine marten reinforcement. So we were looking for optimal areas that had a minimal habitat area and connectivity for viable numbers of pine marten home ranges. So obviously there's no point in releasing animals into an area where you could only viably fit 3 pine marten territories. And we're also looking for areas that had minimum potential conflict and full support of local communities, which is really, really key for reintroductions or projects of this nature. So we settled on a release site in North Ceredigion in mid-Wales. So I don't know, it's pretty far from here, but if anyone knows it, it's roughly between Aberystwyth and Llangeurig. There's a lot of natural forest, and there's very low road network and sort of quite low human population density in that area. So we've carried out 3 phases of translocation of pine martens, starting in 2015 and finishing last year. These were all carried out in the autumn, because this is when there are no dependent pine marten kits. They've all grown up and become independent from their mother. Also, because pine martens mate in the summer months, by the autumn, it's expected that some of the females we were trapping would have already been mated. So we selected donor sites in the Scottish Highlands, in the pine marten's kind of historical stronghold. So these were areas where we knew there was sufficient number of pine martens that by removing a few, we wouldn't be adversely impacting the population. So we've translocated 51 adult pine martens, which is made up of 27 males and 24 females. So almost a 50-50 sex ratio. When the animals were trapped and pre-translocation, they were given a full health check by a wildlife vet. We took various samples, so hair samples for DNA analysis, so we could get a kind of fingerprint for each animal, and also blood samples to look at kind of health status of the animal. And each animal was fitted with a radio collar and also a pit tag, so like a microchip like you put in your cat or dog. So the actual translocation process, the animals were driven down to Wales in these sky kennels, which are kind of like cat carriers that you'd take your cat to the vet in. And they were translocated in a specially adapted animal van. And they were driven overnight from the Scottish Highlands down to mid-Wales, which is about a 10, 11-hour drive. And then they were fed en route. So the photo at the bottom is a pine marten being fed blueberries on a spoon, because they love blueberries. And they eat them in a really kind of comical, like Yogi Bear type manner. Once they arrived in Wales, they were kept in a pre-release pen for 5 days. So this is a soft release, which is opposed to a hard release where you just kind of release the animals out the back of a van. And soft releases are shown to be more successful in that the animals don't disperse so far because they have time to become acclimatized to their new environment. So while they were in their pens, they were fed and monitored remotely with cameras. Then they were soft released and intensively radio tracked. So these are a couple of shots of the release pens that were built by Chester Zoo, who are one of our partners and funders. They measure 2 meters by 3 meters, and you can see that we furnish them with lots of kind of branches and logs and other forest furnishings to make them feel kind of as home as possible. And we have been incredibly pleased with the outcomes of the project. So one of the success criteria we had was that the pine martens would breed, and they have. So over the last 2 springs, we've had at least 9 females breeding, giving birth to at least 15 kits. So the photo on the left is 2 kits, a male and a female, who were born in a den box, which is a specifically made wooden box that we put up on trees, so like similar to a bird box for pine martens. And the kit on the right was actually born in an owl box. So we've had really good breeding success, which is a good indication that the animals are settled. We are now moving on to the kind of wider benefits of a project like this, so really trying to get the community involved, so community ownership of the project. So we've been putting out these lovely interpretation panels in woodlands at the release sites to tell people about the project. We had this pine marten statue that was commissioned last year and launched by Yolo Williams, the TV presenter, who is a patron of our project. So this is a statue of 2 pine marten kits with a mother pine marten on top, and that's in one of the car parks at one of our release sites. And then we've now finished the translocation period of the project, but we still have a lot of work to do. So we are continuing to monitor the pine martens to see what happens and how the population grows. So we do that via radio tracking and also non-invasive surveys, such as camera trapping, and also using scats and hair samples for DNA. We are developing the community involvement in the project. So we have a pine marten den, which is a small information centre, which is being opened in the release area in April. We have a camera trap loan scheme. So for people who live in the area, we can give them a camera trap and they can put it out in their garden or wood to see if they have any pine martens visiting. We've been doing lots of training with volunteers and also trying to work with local businesses to kind of build ecotourism and put a bit more of a value on the pine martens. And we are now considering translocations to other sites in England in the near future. And you probably have heard there's a feasibility study underway looking at pine marten reintroduction in the Forest of Dean, and this is being done by Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, and a decision is due on that in the spring, so watch this space. Thanks very much.